In 1886, an ambitious young doctor moved to Chicago in search of work. After working at a pharmacy for a couple of years, he'd saved up enough money to buy a plot of land across the street. He began building a very strange hotel, and many years later, it was found out that that building had served a far darker purpose than just a hotel. Herman W. Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861 in Gilmington, New Hampshire, to parents Levi and Theodate. His parents were very normal, friendly people according to everyone who knew them, and they were actually descendants of some of the earliest English settlers in the area. They were active members at their Methodist church, and Levi in particular was always quick to lend a helping hand to anyone in the community who needed him. Most people who knew Herman growing up said that he was a very quiet and studious young man. He was particularly popular with his teachers because he was so dedicated to his studies and he did so well in school. He didn't really have much interest in the rambunctious, dirty activities that would have been common for boys at that time. Think Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn. As Herman grew older, he began to retreat further into himself. By age 15, most of his acquaintances would have called him a loner. Instead of hanging out with friends, Herman much preferred to go out for long walks in the woods by himself, sometimes in the dark of night, and his classmates were pretty weirded out by this. He also had an intense fear of bones, and one day at school, he made the mistake of telling his classmates about this fear. That night, a group of boys grabbed him and dragged him to the local doctor's office and locked him inside with a skeleton that was used for anatomy purposes. Herman had expected to be very afraid, but as he looked into the eye holes on the skull, he was actually deeply fascinated by what he saw, not afraid at all, and this started a lifelong interest in human anatomy. As a young teenager, Herman worked for a shoemaker named Charles Boyle. A few months after hiring him, Boyle started to get a weird feeling about Herman, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It probably had to do with Herman's greed, which was starting to become evident at this time. On one occasion, Herman tried to steal 40 cents from his boss, and then another time, he tried to get paid twice for the same job. This intense greed and love of money is something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Herman was so smart that he graduated high school 2 years early at age 16 and very quickly found a teaching position in a nearby town. This was in a time when you didn't need to go to teacher's college or anything like that. You could just be a smart person and graduate with a high school diploma, and you were qualified to be a teacher. Now, as I mentioned, Herman was very hungry for money, so in addition to his teaching job, he would work a number of odd side gigs, usually on his weekends or just in his evenings to make a little more pocket money. On one of these gigs, he worked as a laborer for a family dairy farm nearby. It was on that farm that he met the family's beautiful daughter, Clara. Within a moment of meeting each other, the two had fallen deeply in love. Within 4 months, they'd gotten married in a private ceremony because Clara's parents would have never approved of Herman. The two were just 17 years old at that time. Now, understandably, Clara's family wasn't initially impressed with this marriage. They felt that things had moved far too quickly and that the two of them were too young. But over time, they started to warm up to the idea. They had a great opinion of Herman. He was a hard-working guy, and he'd proved that while working on their farm. But besides that, he'd grown out of being that weird kid that everyone knew him as, and he was actually a very attractive and charming young man by this point. Herman's ambition quickly left him unhappy with this situation. He longed for more out of life than just a lowly position on a dairy farm and a teaching job at a small one-room schoolhouse. He had big plans for himself, and due to his interest in anatomy, he decided to enroll in medical school. Herman initially studied at the University of Vermont for 1 year, but he didn't really like the program at all. It wasn't related to anything he was interested in. So after 1 year, he decided to transfer to the University of Michigan, which at that time was one of the best medical school programs in the entire country and probably the whole world, to be honest. Clara stayed in New Hampshire in order to be close to her family and worked as a dressmaker. She would periodically send Herman money in order to help him pay his way through medical school. Clara was very uneasy about the distance, but the couple talked about the future at length, and Herman assured her that the moment he graduated from medical school, he would move back to New Hampshire and open up a medical practice there, and the two would raise a family and live a happy life. One of the reasons why Michigan's medical program was so renowned around the country was they were one of the few schools who allowed students to operate on real cadavers. A cadaver is a real dead human body that's used for medical purposes. According to Herman's many professors and his classmates, he was an excellent student, just like he'd been in high school, and he showed a particular interest and motivation for the anatomy portion of the program. Outside of the classroom, though, Herman and Clara began to fall apart. She would try to come visit him once or twice a semester, but it just wasn't enough to sustain their relationship, and as graduation loomed on the forefront, she just got the sense that Herman had no intention of moving back to New Hampshire. It was just a gut instinct, and because of this, she grew very cold towards her husband. While the two never formally divorced, they never signed the paperwork. Their relationship was essentially over when Herman graduated from Michigan in 1884, and they never spoke again. Eager to make a big name for himself and build a fortune, Herman moved to Chicago in 1886 and adopted a new name, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes for short. He just thought it sounded a little bit more professional. Shortly after moving to Chicago, Holmes was reading a newspaper, and a job ad caught his attention. Help wanted at a family-owned pharmacy. He read the description, and the owners were looking for someone with medical knowledge. The further Holmes read, he realized he was a perfect fit for this job, and it paid a lot better than most of the other gigs that he was scouting out, so he sent a telegraph and quickly set up a meeting. The pharmacy was run by a married couple, Elizabeth and Edward Holton. Now, the problem was Edward was terribly sick with cancer and had been for the last year. He was essentially withering away, and he had been the main person behind the operations of the pharmacy. Elizabeth was essentially just an assistant, and she didn't really have the knowledge nor the expertise to be able to run the pharmacy properly. So with her husband ill, that's what prompted them to post this job listing. Holmes was deeply charming in his interview. He appeared deeply concerned for Edward's health, and he also demonstrated his depth of medical knowledge, which made sense because he just graduated from this great program, right? Elizabeth was smitten right from the start, and she hired him on the spot to take over operations of the pharmacy. Holmes performed very well in his new role, and over time he gradually adopted more and more responsibility, and he had a pretty good mind for numbers too, so he implemented some new policies that resulted in much better financial performance of the business. A year after Holmes had taken over, Edward Holton sadly died of cancer. Elizabeth was frantic and very stressed. He'd accumulated this huge amount of medical debt, and in order to pay that off, she needed a large sum of money, so because of that, she decided to sell the pharmacy to Holmes. Shortly after Holmes had bought the pharmacy, he set his sights on an open piece of land located directly across the street from the pharmacy. So Holmes bought the land. Now, you're probably wondering, how the heck did this guy afford to buy a pharmacy and then a piece of land when just a few short years earlier he was strapped for cash? Well, the truth was, since graduating medical school, he had slowly turned himself into a con artist. One of his favorite schemes would be traveling to different parts of the country and borrowing a large sum of money and then never paying it back and never traveling back to that lender. And he just did this over and over again. And this was a time before credit scores or background checks, so a lot of things just relied on honesty, and Herman took advantage of that. He repeated this cycle so many times that he amassed a pretty sizable fortune. After buying the land, he began a construction project. On the outside, the building looked very normal. The ground level would be for retail services. On the second floor, he would run it as a hotel. And then on the third floor, there would be apartments that he would rent out to tenants on a longer-term basis. Right from the start, though, the construction process was very bizarre. First of all, instead of hiring a general contractor, which would be expected for a project of this scope, Holmes served as his own GC. He would bring in a crew of laborers for a very short period of time, maybe a week or two, and then he would fire them and promptly bring in another crew of laborers. There were two reasons why Holmes decided to do this. The first one was it allowed him to avoid paying his laborers, so he could just get away with a lot of free stuff, and most of these tradesmen didn't have the means nor the acquaintances to fight these things in court, so he got away with it. But the second reason was much darker. Because no one saw the interior construction from start to finish, no one really had a good idea of what was going on inside the building. No one except Holmes, and this was by design. Onlookers were also very perplexed when they saw laborers carting in this gigantic glass furnace into the basement. And when asked about it, Holmes said that he needed it down there because he was making curved window panes for some of the retail spots in the building. And it was even more strange when people saw a 15-foot cubic metal vault installed in the second floor. Holmes never did say what the purpose for that was. Now, this monumental building project took most of Holmes's attention away from the pharmacy, and he needed to hire some help in order to keep the operations moving. A couple named Ned and Julia Conners had recently moved to Chicago with their 6-year-old daughter Pearl in search of a better life. They were originally from Iowa and they were poor wheat farmers. Their savings were quickly running out, and when they saw a newspaper ad for a job at Holmes's pharmacy, they quickly sent a telegraph and applied. Holmes was so impressed with the couple that he hired them after just one single interview. Ned would serve as the pharmacy manager, and then Julia, who had some understanding of accounting and numbers, would run the books for the business. Ned was deeply impressed by his boss. Ned's life hadn't turned out nearly the way he'd wanted it to, and he realized that his wife Julia had slowly lost respect for him over the years. But Holmes represented this smart, intelligent, and attractive, powerful business tycoon that Ned always wanted to be but never achieved, and he kind of started to live vicariously through his boss. As Ned continued to develop admiration for his boss, he started to see a problem. Holmes was spending a lot of time with his wife Julia, and reading their body language, he could see that there was something between them. Holmes and Julia began going on dates, and after a couple months, Ned knew that he'd lost his wife. Dejected, defeated, he returned back home to Iowa, a broken man. The relationship between Holmes and Julia moved at a rapid pace. Julia filed for divorce from Ned, and Holmes began planning this big, extravagant, expensive wedding for the two of them. But a few weeks before Julia and Ned's divorce was set to take effect, Julia and her daughter Pearl suddenly disappeared. When other pharmacy employees asked Holmes what had become of Julia, he didn't answer, but anytime that topic was brought up, he got this very deep, sad expression on his face, as if he was about to break into tears. Eventually, one of the cashiers who knew Holmes best sat down with him in a private conversation and learned the truth of what had happened. Julia had claimed that for her daughter's sake, she needed to get back with her husband Ned. After all, he was her true father. So she just left Holmes and returned to Iowa, and the only explanation she left him with was this cold, heartless note that she'd left at his apartment. After Ned and Julia Conners left Chicago, Holmes was still grieving, but he did need someone to fill their place. He hired a man named Benjamin Pitzel, who had recently moved to Chicago with his wife Carrie and their 6 young children. Pitzel had some rudimentary understanding of chemistry, which was certainly helpful for him in the pharmacy, but he was also a big, strong man, and this allowed him to serve in some different capacities for Holmes. Holmes himself was a very slight man, just 5'8" tall and about 140 pounds. Pitzel was a hard-working and mostly honest man, but he wasn't overly intelligent, and he also had a habit of drinking in public places, and when he got drunk, he would share too many details with strangers, and this really unnerved Holmes. Pitzel's drinking problem got so bad that Holmes threatened to fire him, but he agreed to let him keep his job on the contingency that he would go to a rehab facility and get cured of this addiction. So Pitzel enrolled, and while he was there, he met this very cute young secretary named Emeline Cigrand. Since Julia had left Chicago to get back with her husband Ned, Holmes still hadn't rehired for that accountant bookkeeper position. He'd been filling the gaps in himself, but it wasn't a great fit. He wasn't super organized, and he didn't love numbers, and there were plenty of other business interests that were needing his time, so hiring for this became a priority. When Pitzel told Holmes about Emeline, he quickly wrote to her and offered to double her salary if she agreed to fill this bookkeeper position for him. Emeline, who was a very ambitious young woman, quickly wrote back and accepted the job. It seemed like a no-brainer, almost too good to be true. Shortly after Emeline started work, Holmes began spending a lot of time at the pharmacy again, which seemed very strange because he had all these other business interests going on, like I mentioned, but the whole reason why he'd hired Pitzel and Emeline was so that he didn't have to spend a lot of time at the pharmacy. He spent weeks training Emeline, and the other employees started to notice things. He would stare at her and she would look back into his deep blue eyes for just a little bit too long, and pretty quickly they were going on frequent dates on the town in the evenings. Things progressed like this for about 6 months. Holmes would pop in and check on Emeline, and then the two of them would go on a date later that evening, and they began to fall deeply in love with each other. And things went great until one night. The two were out on the town, as they so often were, and Holmes mentioned that he wanted to check out a men's clothing store, and on the other side of the street, Emeline happened to see some dresses that caught her attention, so the two agreed to part ways for a couple of minutes, and then they would rejoin each other in the street. When Holmes left the store, he noticed Emeline talking to a young man. He made contact with this young man for a second, but the man quickly walked the other direction very briskly. That man's name was Louis Martin. He was from France, and he was visiting some distant relatives in Chicago for a couple of weeks. When Holmes asked Emeline about this, she just brushed it off, saying he was an old friend she hadn't seen in years and they were just catching up. Holmes didn't think much of it. At this point, they'd built up a lot of trust with each other, and it didn't really bother him until the next morning when Emeline didn't show up for work. When Holmes returned that evening, he made a very troubling discovery. Slid under his door was a note from Emeline explaining that she had abruptly left the country in order to marry Louis in France, and she'd be living with him there. Holmes was absolutely shattered, even worse than when Julia had left him. So after a few months, Emeline's parents hadn't heard from her in a while, and her father knew who Holmes was. He'd never met him in person, but he knew who he was, so he wrote him a letter just wondering if Holmes knew anything about where Emeline was, and Holmes just responded with a very short and to-the-point letter explaining the situation with Louis and how Emeline had moved to France in order to marry him. The Chicago World's Fair in 1893 brought a huge amount of business into Holmes's hotel, but as it was going on, an alarming number of people started to go missing in the city of Chicago, and the police department was so overwhelmed with crime. Chicago was a hotbed for crime at this time. They just didn't have the resources in order to investigate most of these disappearances, and most of them went unsolved. As the fair concluded, business at the hotel began to slow down, and Holmes, who had a lot of expenses at this time, needed a new way to make money, and he searched for a new business enterprise, and with that, he enlisted the help of his trusted lieutenant, Benjamin Pitzel. Holmes concocted this scheme where the two of them would open up an insurance policy for $10,000 under Pitzel's name, and then fake his death, collect the payout, and split it between the two of them. The two would use one of Holmes's medical cadavers as proof of death. It would be a real human body, but they would emaciate the face to the point where it couldn't be properly identified. Pitzel would then go undercover with a fake name and a disguise, and after a few months, the two of them would collect the money. On paper, Pitzel's wife, Carrie, would be the beneficiary of the insurance program. She was still living in Chicago at this time with the 6 children, and to be honest, she was increasingly uneasy about this scheme. It just didn't sit right with her, but Pitzel assured her that Holmes had done this successfully before, and ultimately, if it worked, it could be the end of their money troubles. And remember, they're a very poor family. They hadn't come from a wealthy upbringing, so money was a constant source of stress for them. As Pitzel and Holmes opened up this insurance plan, they also started a new pharmacy just to serve as a cover-up. They would wait a few months and then stage Pitzel's death in the pharmacy and claim that it was some type of chemical explosion that had caused the death, and that would explain the emaciated cadaver that they were using, because remember, the body wasn't going to be Pitzel's actual dead body. In the coming weeks, Pitzel worked in the pharmacy, and Holmes actually traveled to St. Louis in order to conduct another smaller scheme to bring in a smaller amount of money. He was actually caught doing this and arrested on a petty charge and sentenced to 1 year in prison. While in prison, his cell was actually located right beside a very famous outlaw named Marion Hedgepath. For some reason that we just don't know, Holmes decided to share the entire insurance scheme with Hedgepath, and he was deeply excited about the plan the moment that he heard about it. For a $500 cut of the payout, he agreed to get Holmes in touch with a world-renowned criminal lawyer who could help facilitate this whole scheme and just make sure that it went through smoothly. This seemed like a no-brainer to Holmes, because $500 wasn't really a huge percentage of the $10,000 they'd be getting for the policy, and he quickly agreed to it. A couple weeks later, Pitzel traveled to St. Louis and paid Holmes' bail, and he was out of prison. Now, in addition to sharing the insurance scheme with Hedgepath, Holmes also revealed much darker, more troubling things about his life, and this seems like a footnote, but it's going to be very important later, so remember it. Holmes returned to Philadelphia very briefly and then returned to Chicago in order to visit Pitzel's wife, Carrie, and their 6 children. Carrie was planning to travel to Philly in order to meet up with her husband there, but she was stressed out of her mind because 3 of her children were very sick and she wasn't able to take care of the house in the way she normally would. So Holmes, sensing this stress, just made himself available and offered to take 3 of the children himself to Philly, and this would leave Carrie with the other 3 so she could help them recover. Once they were feeling better, all of them would go to Philadelphia and meet up with Benjamin Pitzel. Shortly before Holmes made this visit to Chicago, a 14-year-old boy walked into Holmes and Pitzel's pharmacy in Philadelphia, the new one that they had started as a cover-up. The boy's name was William Abbott, and he came into the pharmacy almost every day to get his chocolate milkshake. This was in a day when pharmacies would sell, in addition to medicine, sweets, things like milkshakes, and even some food items like burgers and fries. William was surprised when he didn't see anyone behind the counter. He'd become used to seeing Pitzel there because he came in so frequently, but he was eager for his milkshake, so the boy called out to the back room, just seeing if anyone was there who could help him, and when no one responded to this, he timidly walked towards the back of the pharmacy, and when he got into one of the back rooms, he saw something horrifying. It was an emaciated body that had clearly been lying there for some time, and it had this bubbling red liquid coming out of the mouth. William had been in the pharmacy enough times to know that this was the body of Benjamin Pitzel. While it was initially suspected that Pitzel had died due to some type of chemical explosion, an accident back there, upon doing an autopsy, doctors found a large amount of chloroform in Pitzel's stomach, which seemed strange. There was a chance that he drank chloroform in order to kill himself, but anyone who knew him said that wasn't really very likely. So then the very obvious option was that someone had murdered Benjamin Pitzel. Now, it was common knowledge that Holmes and Pitzel worked together, so because of this, Holmes was immediately suspected of the murder, but authorities just didn't have a lot of evidence in order to convict him, at least not yet. Despite Holmes not being arrested, the case made nationwide news, and remember that outlaw in prison, Marion Hedgepath? Well, when he caught wind of this scheme, he remembered he hadn't been paid his $500 cut, right? And he'd got Holmes in touch with this lawyer, and that was the deal they had arranged. And when he realized he didn't have his money, he became very angry, furious. In retaliation, Hedgepath went to the authorities himself and told them everything that he knew about Dr. H.H. Holmes. Armed with this testimony, police arrested H.H. Holmes for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel. The night before Pitzel was found by William Abbott, Holmes had stopped by the pharmacy after returning from St. Louis just to have a visit with Pitzel. The two sat down, and Holmes poured them a few drinks. Pitzel was still a functioning alcoholic at this time, so didn't really know moderation when it came to alcohol, and within an hour or so, he was stumbling drunk. After he passed out in a back room of the pharmacy, Holmes doused a handkerchief with chloroform and held it over Pitzel's mouth for several minutes. He then poured the remaining chloroform down Pitzel's throat and created a crude cover-up to make things look like an accident, but obviously when the authorities conducted the autopsy, this didn't work. In reality, Holmes had no intention of splitting that $10,000 with Pitzel. His plan all along was to kill Pitzel and then keep the entire sum of money for himself. Now, the arrest of Holmes prompted a detailed investigation of his castle back in Chicago, and what police found in there shocked the world. The building was full of strange things: secret trapdoors, staircases that led to nowhere, soundproof rooms, and a greased-up metal chute that led from the second floor down to the basement. And if you remember, nobody besides Holmes actually knew everything was in the building because he'd had so many crews in and out of the job site. And this was done very intentionally because Holmes had built that hotel with the sole purpose of murdering people. Holmes would prey on guests at his hotel, usually wealthy women, so he could steal their money afterwards. They would leave their room in search of the bathroom in the middle of the night, and because the layout of the hotel was so strange, they would become lost and trapped in one of these secret rooms where Dr. Holmes was waiting for them. And in addition to stealing the money, he would usually sell the bodies to medical institutions as cadavers. Now, you're probably wondering, how the heck could these institutions accept dead bodies without doing some type of investigation or background into how the person died? Well, the reality was, at that time, cadavers were so hard to come by and they were so useful for medical research that the institutions had no choice but to accept anything they got, and Holmes deeply aware of the medical community because he had a medical degree, knew this, and he exploited this fact. The bodies that Holmes didn't manage to sell, he would dispose of in the basement using that quote-unquote glass furnace. In reality, it wasn't a glass furnace at all, it was used to burn human remains. In the basement, police also found a giant vat of acid that was also used for disposal and a collection of human bones. We don't know the exact number of murders that happened in that horrific building. Holmes claimed it was 29, but some modern historians estimate that it could be upwards of 100. Remember Julia Conners and Emeline Cigrand? Those stories that Holmes had told about Julia getting back with Ned for the child and Emeline moving to France to be with Louis Martin were complete bogus cover-ups. There was not an ounce of truth to them. One evening in 1892, after a night on the town, Emeline and Holmes returned to his hotel, and Holmes said that he had something to show her. Now, Emeline, who was stumbling drunk at this point, happily agreed, and she went up to the second floor with Holmes. He opened up a secret door, and this revealed that 15-foot cubicle vault that he'd had installed many years earlier when the building was being finished. Holmes turned to Emeline and he said with a smile on his face, "Hey, why don't you just step in there, I'll shut the door, and you make some noise, and let's see how soundproof this thing actually is, just as a joke." Emeline, who was a very innocent and gullible young lady, happily agreed. She jumped in the vault, and Holmes immediately slammed the door and locked it shut. At first, Emeline thought it was a joke as Holmes had played it off, and she was giggling for a couple of minutes, but she quickly realized that Holmes had no intention of letting her out of that vault ever. He enjoyed listening to her scream and plead for about 15 minutes, and then he flicked a switch. That switch activated carbon monoxide gas that was funneled into the vault through a ceiling pipe. In the last moments of her life, in a desperate attempt to escape, Emeline pressed her bare foot into the door of the vault so hard that it left a visible imprint from the outside. And this is one of the horrific things that police discovered in their investigation. 1 year earlier, as Julia Conners planned her wedding with Holmes, she made a very troubling and upsetting discovery. She sat her lover down and battled tears and explained to Holmes that she was pregnant with Holmes's child, and this was obviously not a planned thing. Holmes was very calm and stoic in response and said that this had no impact on his desire to marry Julia, and she was very relieved to hear this. But he did mention that in order to avoid any scandal and just start their marriage on the right foot, because that's obviously what they wanted to do, it would be best if Julia had an abortion. Abortions were highly experimental and honestly very unsafe at that time, but Holmes, who was a doctor, remember, assured Julia that he'd done the procedure many times and it wouldn't be a big deal. It'd be over in a couple of minutes. Julia reluctantly agreed, and Holmes slowly led her to the basement of his hotel. He laid her down on a wooden operating table and began organizing his large collection of surgical instruments. But instead of performing the abortion like he said he would, Holmes just began stabbing Julia repeatedly until she died. And what's even worse than that is, shortly after he'd done that, he took the life of Julia's 6-year-old daughter, Pearl. Now, as horrific as these things were, this wasn't the end of Holmes's evil. Remember how he returned to Chicago in order to visit Pitzel's wife, Carrie, and their 6 children, and then took 3 of the children with him, promising to take them to Philadelphia to meet with their father? Well, he never took them to Philadelphia. Instead, he took them on this winding trip throughout the continent, murdering and burying all 3 of them in different locations in the United States and Canada. If you remember, Carrie on paper was actually the beneficiary of the life insurance plan, and with her and the children still in the picture, Holmes wouldn't get any of the payout for himself. And remember, this was the whole point of doing it. After murdering the 3 children he took with him, Holmes had planned to return to Chicago and finish the job, but luckily police arrested him before he could do that. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was hung for his crimes. The hanging process was supposed to break a criminal's neck upon impact, but with Holmes it didn't work out this way, and he just hung there struggling, slowly choking to death, and after 20 minutes, he finally died of lack of oxygen. Shortly before his death, Holmes was quoted as saying this: "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to write. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside my bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me ever since." Thanks for listening.